Dr. Robert Gray is Chief Scientist in the Cyber Technology Group at BAE Systems. He has a great deal of experience with cyber defense systems for tactical, enterprise, and industrial networks. He has his degrees from the University of Vermont and Dartmouth College. And thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much. So good afternoon, everybody, or almost afternoon. So just as you gathered, from the talks already today, there's dramatically growing awareness of, how deep the cyber threat, to critical national infrastructure, actually goes. And, this awareness has already led to some relatively, draconian decisions, even just, at local levels. So for example, we do quite a bit of work with the Worcester, Polytechnic Institute, which has one of the few degree programs in the country, devoted to grid and power management. And many of their faculty are drawn from, utilities, and other, critical infrastructure, providers. There used to be a chief technology officer or a CEO, actually in, the infrastructure, community. One of those faculty members was telling us, that his small utility had gone to great expense, to fully network, all of their substations, and eliminate, a lot of the engineer and truck visits, out to those substations. As they became increasingly aware, though, of, the cyber threat that they had exposed themselves to, they actually went back through and physically disconnected all of these, connections and accepted the cost of reinstating, these truck, and engineer, visits. So that's an example of very high, awareness, and they were very willing to make, tough, financial, decisions. At the same time, awareness, is still, very spotty. One of our professional colleagues, just a few years ago, was talking to a person who was in charge of a particular, organization, who felt, that his organization, was very able to withstand, failures and malicious attacks, against the electric grid because, they had two redundant lines, coming in, to the physical site. It turned out, that, this site leader, was unaware of how quickly those two lines converged, outside of his site, well within the local, area. And so, he was just as vulnerable, as anyone else to any attack or failure that took place before, that, convergence point. And so, despite the increasing awareness, awareness is still, not complete. And as other speakers, have already, talked about, the attack threat, really is racing ahead, of the current ability to defend, against those attacks. And, there are many different sides, to the attack surface, within the critical, national infrastructure. There's the true remote attack, which are the ones you most often, read about in the news, where, some remote attacker, in your favorite remote country, is exploiting whatever software flaw, across the network, to gain a position, on some staging or other, target, from which they can continue, their activities. But that's only one small part, of the overall problem. There's also the Stuxnet style, attacks, where the ultimate target, is never connected, to the network. But there's some second device, perhaps as a diagnostic device, that is sometimes connected, to the network. Maybe you're downloading the next version, of the diagnostic software. If an attack reaches that device at that time, it later is in a position to jump to the actual target, when the diagnostic device is actually used to diagnose, some substation problem or other problem, within the infrastructure. At least one of the other speakers, has also, talked a bit about, insider attack. If a staging target, to borrow, his phrase, is in some way trusted, by other parts of the system, that staging target, has actually allowed the attacker to already become something of an insider. They are in a position of trust, even though they're an attacker, that they were not in before. And that's even, setting aside the case where there's actually an insider person, who might be cooperating with whatever, outside, group. A special case of insider attack, is supply chain attack, where, the supply chain for the hardware, the devices that are going in the substations, the supply chain for the software, the different contractors who are developing the software, the design process or the implementation process, the manufacturing process, that's what's compromised. And in that case, the attack code is already resident, on the device, in the software, before the utility even turns the device on for the first time. And then finally, there of course is the, increasing trend towards smart homes, and smart buildings, including buildings that are providing power, back to the grid, because they have solar, or whatever other, local, capability. Even things like Alexa, Alexa obviously does not have a connection directly, to the grid. But if through a supply chain attack, I was able to compromise, a significant, fraction of, installed Alexas, I could start inducing, very large power draws, completely synchronized, across relatively large, areas, which would have its own, significant, impact. Now there is a small silver lining, at least in the case of, what you would think of as the nation-state, adversaries. A nation-state actor, generally does not want to just launch their attack. The attack activates right away, and they have no more, control over it. The nation-state adversary is seeking to gain some tactical, or strategic advantage, at a specific time. So they want to pre-install their attack, but then be able to activate it, when they actually want, to do something. So that means they have to maintain positive control over it. They have to be able to, in some way trigger it, at the desired time. And that does become, a new avenue, for cyber defense. That if you can, block what would have been the triggering event, the attack code is then largely, inert. Now all that said, despite what we've already seen, the Indestroyer, attack in the Ukraine, that the ESET speaker described, the 20 recent, security incidents, that, went into, the DHS, alert, attackers really have only scratched the surface, of what they can do. And the current cyber defenses, are simply insufficient. Many utilities are not yet using best practices, not through any lack of desire, but just because, the critical infrastructure is much more newly networked, than in many other domains. Banking and finance, they've been networked, far longer, than some of these infrastructure, elements. Current best practices also deal very poorly with Stuxnet style attacks, insider attacks, and supply chain, attacks, which are also, a critical threat. And then, finally, if the worst does occur, and some attack has led to a very large scale, even nation scale, power outage, there's very little capability to rapidly go in, rapidly investigate, see what the attack has done and undo it, enough to get the power, back on. Now there is existing work already. DARPA, for example, has their RADIX program, which stands for Rapid Attack Detection, Isolation, and Characterization, systems. But its purpose is to research and develop, tools for doing exactly what I just said. These might be tools that you place in the hands of highly specialized teams, perhaps within, existing National Guard, cyber units, but as first responders, in a truly large-scale power outage, they would be the ones going in first. What happened? Can we get the power back on in 1 day instead of 7, or 7 days instead of, 3 months? So there is, a lot of current activity, on the research and development side, like the DARPA program I just mentioned, Representative McNerney, mentioned the two pieces, of legislation, that he's already, drafted. We heard about the new initiatives, at the Department of Energy, also at NIST, the workforce development, efforts, that Raytheon, has undertaken, which are all, key pieces of an overall, solution. At the same time, as a researcher who has been deeply immersed in just how bad, things can be if the attacker is truly determined, it is hard for me to imagine, that we can fully address the problem, in a timely way, without the modern equivalent, of the Rural Electrification Act, perhaps the Secure Electrification Act, of 2019, or something, similar. Because at this point, it does feel, that without, a concerted push, with the full faith and funding, of the U.S. government, behind it, that there is a very real danger, of attacker-caused catastrophe, sooner than these individual efforts, no matter how well coordinated, can, truly make their way, into the utilities, into the infrastructure, and do what needs to be done in terms of the defense. Thank you very much.